Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm going to focus more on the editorial aspect of managing a co-production. I have been here working in Europe for 12 years now, and during those 12 years I think I've done 7 co-productions, and I have a lot more gray hair as a result. Co-productions are not for the faint of heart. They are, by definition, much more difficult than a single production with a single broadcaster. But they're also quite rewarding, and I keep doing them despite the challenges they pose. But I thought what I would do today is sort of compare and contrast 2 co-productions that I've done, and then offer a couple of lessons learned from those experiences. And if we have any time left at the end of my chat, any questions you may have, I'd be very eager to answer. So I'm not used to doing highly structured presentations like this, so bear with me if I have to look at my script a little more than I would normally. But I prepared a slideshow for you. The first show I want to talk about is a co-production called Ransom. And this was an episodic crime series that ran for 3 seasons, from January 2017 to May 2019. And the journey for me on this show began in 2013 when I was in Paris with my wife, and I was approached by 2 French producers at Wildcats Productions, Valerie Pichel and Odile MacDonald. And they were in conversation already with TF1, one of the most important French broadcasters, about doing a TV series inspired by the life of a real-life negotiator, hostage and kidnap negotiator. And TF1 was interested in the concept of doing a series based on this negotiator. And Valerie and Odile had already been speaking to a Canadian production company called Sienna, based in Toronto, which is headed by Julia Sereni and Jennifer Kawaja. And they were talking to a Canadian broadcaster called Global, Chorus Global, who are also, in principle, interested in the idea of doing a series about this hostage negotiator. And then the last partner in this project was the distributor E1, a very big distributor. And the idea was that this would be an English language, French-Canadian co-production that could be sold into the United States and other territories, obviously all over the world. But there was no commitment from any broadcaster, and they felt they needed an EP showrunner like me to help sell the project and to conceive it. So Big Light, my company based in London, came on board. And for me, editorially, I really liked the idea of a hero who had to solve problems with his mind rather than with a gun. Because if you're a hostage negotiator, the enemy is violence. You're trying to stop violence from happening, right? So you have to understand the bad guy better than they understand themselves and get them to put down their weapons and not kill people and hurt them. It's harder to make that exciting and dramatic because, in fact, audiences like violence. But I thought it was a unique idea, and I was really intrigued by it. So as you can see, we had at this point 3 production companies and a distributor, and no confirmed broadcasters as yet. Julia and Jennifer, the Canadian partners at Sienna, had identified a Canadian writer named David Vinola, whom they'd worked with on a show called Combat Hospital. So I read David's material, spoke to him about the idea, really liked him, and I agreed to supervise David's writing of the pilot episode. And then David and I began a series of meetings with Laurent Comblebert and Marwan Meri, who were the hostage negotiators that Valerie and Odile had identified as the source for our show. And fascinating characters, and we met with them several times over the course of many months and began to develop a pilot episode and a way to tell these stories. And that took the better part of a year. And then we submitted the script. We went through the development process with E1 and Wildcats and Sienna, and then we submitted the script to Global in Canada and to TF1 in France. And while we were waiting for answers from them, E1 arranged for me to fly out to Los Angeles to pitch the show to CBS in Los Angeles. And to our delight, CBS agreed to pick up the show. But there was one massive catch. CBS wanted to broadcast the show on Saturday night, which was a night that they had no programming. So they were sort of swimming against the tide, because as you know, like, network viewership has been declining in America, and they were trying to add a new night of programming on Saturday night, and they wanted to use Ransom as the anchor for Saturday night programming. So the upside of that was that the bar for the ratings would be quite low, so we were likely to be renewed indefinitely. The downside was, consequently, the license fee was going to be lower than it would be if it were on a weeknight. So at this point, we now had, once CBS said yes, Global and TF1 also said yes, but there was a further complication, because Canada and the US, when they do shows together, they simulcast, right? Because people in Canada can see American shows, and they don't want the American broadcaster siphoning off the viewers for the Canadian broadcaster. But Global has no programming on Saturday night, of course. So that was a very complicated negotiation, and finally Global agreed to show Ransom 2 nights later, and we were able to proceed with 3 broadcasters. However, E1 felt that with the reduced license fee from CBS, they didn't have enough money. It was too big of a deficit they were going to run on the show. So we arranged to pitch the show to a 4th broadcaster, being RTL. And they came on board as well. So 4 broadcasters, you might think that sounds like an awful lot of broadcasters, and you would be right. But we told ourselves, look, they all want the kind of shows that CBS makes, because CBS shows work well on all of these platforms. So they'll all probably fall in line with CBS's editorial direction. It'll be fine. And with that, we were greenlit to series. So we have quite a lot of partners here. 1 distributor, 3 production companies, and 4 broadcasters, and a partridge in a pear tree. We began shooting in 2016, and despite the crowd, we found a way to divide responsibilities really well. Big Light, my company, took the editorial lead, and we would get notes on all the treatments and the scripts from Sienna and Wildcats. We ran a writer's room in London. We had writers from Canada, the UK, and France, the French writer working in English. And the show, the first season was shot in Toronto, where Sienna took primary production responsibility, and in the south of France, where Wildcats took primary production responsibility. And then we did the post-production in Toronto. So we found a way to divide our functions really pretty well. The problem was that all 4 networks, Global, TF1, CBS, and RTL, were true co-production partners, which meant that we got 4 sets of notes on every treatment, every script, and every edit. As I said, we'd assumed that because everybody wanted CBS-type shows, well, whatever CBS said, the rest would kind of agree. Well, that was not correct. And in many cases, the notes conflicted with each other. And so with every episode that first season, we are trying to find a way. It was like the UN, right? We're trying to negotiate with all these broadcasters and come up with solutions that pleased everybody. And it was quite hair-raising. And if I'm really honest, I think it wasn't always the best thing editorially for the show. Not a great surprise that we were having to balance all these voices and come up with solutions. And at times, it was quite tense trying to get them all to sign off, before we began shooting each episode. The funniest story is the final episode of season 1. Everybody loved the story, but TF1 didn't believe, it was sort of an espionage story. They didn't believe that it would take place in France. So they loved the story, they loved the episode. Even though production at this point was shooting in the south of France, they said we needed to reset the story in the United States. So we had to make Nice look like Washington, D.C., which we did. Nonetheless, the show did very well when it premiered on CBS. It began on a weeknight, it got bigger ratings than some of the regular shows, and then moved to Saturday, where it performed above their expectations. Did very well on Global. It was delayed in its broadcast in France because of dubbing. It didn't premiere there for like another 5 or 6 months. Also did very well in France. Didn't do so well on RTL, where they put it on their Vox platform. And so in the second season, both TF1 and RTL dropped out. So now we had CBS and Global. We only had 2 partners in the second season, which from an editorial standpoint, nobody was crying about, but was a challenge for E1, which was carrying the deficit on the show. And so we no longer qualified as a French-Canadian co-production. We now had to move filming from Toronto and the south of France to Budapest. But we only had 2 sets of notes now. And actually, things went very smoothly in season 2 and in season 3, in 2018 and 2019. And now season 4 comes along, and Global immediately renews the show, and so does CBS. However, CBS is going through cost cutting. And they say, we want the show, but we need to reduce our license fee. E1, which was already carrying a pretty significant deficit, said that doesn't work for us. And rumors began to circulate that the show was going to be canceled because they couldn't reach a deal with CBS. And I said to E1, please don't cancel the show. Let's see if we can find another buyer for Ransom for season 4. And we set about calling all these buyers in the United States, and lo and behold, we found a platform that was willing to take Ransom for 2 seasons at a license fee higher than CBS had ever paid for it. So I was declaring victory, I was thrilled. It turned out that nobody had told Global that the show wasn't canceled, and they'd already released the funds to another show. And so we were canceled, in fact. Very frustrating. So unfair. You see why it gives you gray hair, this thing. It's very difficult. Didn't see that coming. So after 3 seasons, that was the end of Ransom. So that's case study number 1, which I'd like to compare to another show I did starting in 2018 called Leonardo, about Leonardo da Vinci. And it stands in pretty sharp contrast to my experience. This was done for the Alliance. So here we partnered with Lux Vitae in Rome, which is the biggest independent producer, no longer independent, now owned by Fremantle, but at the time, the biggest independent producer in Italy. And we'd already worked with them for several years doing 3 seasons of the Medici series for Netflix and Rai. In this case, Lux, before we came on board, had already signed a deal with a distributor, Sony Pictures, and they had 2 of the 3 members of the Alliance, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, on board, which was Rai and France Télévisions. And then a third broadcaster would come on board during pre-production, which was RTVE in Spain. So it looks pretty crowded again, doesn't it? I mean, that's a lot of logos up there. But in fact, our experience doing Leonardo was far less complicated than our experience doing Ransom. That's because under the Alliance agreement, 1 broadcaster would deal with the editorial team. And in this case, that broadcaster was Rai, which was the principal commissioner of the show, since Leonardo was an Italian. And the idea of the Alliance was that there's 1 lead broadcaster who then shares all the editorial material with the other broadcasters, hears their notes, and then feeds back in one voice the editorial line to us, the editorial team. So during series development, in fact, we only met with France Télévisions twice. and we never spoke to RTVE. So all of our notes came directly, I spoke to RTV at the premiere of the show, actually. So all of our notes came directly from Rye, which was really a delight. We began filming in 2020, and like Medici, the series benefited from production tax credits and incentives for shooting in Tuscany. But unlike Medici, we were still 7 weeks away from finishing production when the COVID pandemic forced us to shut down in March 2020. Many of the locations where we were due to shoot were in the north of Italy, where you may recall the worst of the pandemic outbreak began. Fortunately, we had already begun to build a very small backlot we were going to use for some of the scenes north of Rome. So when we shut down in March, we greatly expanded the size of that backlot, which allowed us then to resume shooting in July of that year, and we were able to complete production without any further interruptions. And then Leonardo premiered on Rai in March 2021, watched by more than 7 million people. It was one of the highest rated programs of the year, and a big success and a very happy ending. So the two lessons that I have from these experiences are, first of all, if you're going to do a co-production, have the broadcasters speak with one voice. Make the job of coordinating the editorial line theirs, not yours. It's just too difficult if you're trying to run a show to negotiate competing editorial points of view, and better that it's their problem instead of the producers. And the second lesson is to define the partner roles clearly. Because I would say the one thing that both Ransom and Leonardo had in common that was successful was that it was very clear the delineation of what each of the production partners was asked to do. And so editorially, that made both shows function smoothly. And there you have it. Any questions from anybody? Yes, please. Yes. So she was just asking, can I talk about the roles of the distributors, whether it's E1 or Sony, and what role they played in the show. So in both instances, we got editorial notes from E1 on Ransom and from Sony. I would say, though, that the notes tended to be much more general and not terribly intrusive, and that really both distributors left it up to the editorial team to develop the scripts and to deal with the broadcasters and their notes. I think that, particularly in the first season of Ransom, E1 was focused on making sure that we were keeping the different broadcast partners happy. Leonardo was different because it was only a limited series. It was never intended to return. And then I guess the other issue would be a budget issue. And it's interesting because coming from an American television background, it's not like any broadcaster is offering you a lot of flexibility when it comes to budget, but in co-productions I find there's no flexibility. I mean, in an American setting, when you're dealing with a big American broadcaster, sometimes that you will have discussions about breakage, but it just doesn't happen in my experience with co-productions. This is the number, this is the schedule, and you've got to hit it. And also, in the case of Leonardo or Medici, we had to have all the scripts written before we began shooting. And it was scheduled like one giant feature, which is something you would never do. Like, Ransom wasn't done that way. Ransom was done the traditional North American way, which is you're writing and shooting at the same time. But I'd say both E1 and Sony were not intrusive in any way and largely supportive.
Hi, thanks very much for that, Frank. I was interested in the early development of Ransom, and you were talking about kind of developing the series and the pilot script before you had the green light. Who was funding that development?
E1, yeah. But I think they had a lot of confidence because we'd had I can't even tell you how many meetings we had with TF1 before, and we knew there was serious interest, so I think they felt pretty secure that their investment was going to pay off.
Hi. I was wondering, when I hear about co-productions, there are several criteria based on which roles within the co-production can be divided. Like you mentioned, based on location in one case, then maybe based on creativity process, financial. So what are the usual criteria for development of roles within a co-production team?
So it varies from production to production. In the case of Ransom, it was really E1 that was underwriting the show. And so Sienna, Wildcats, and Big Light all had to negotiate our fees and participation with E1. And it was transparent. We knew what everybody else was getting. But E1 was the one writing the checks and sort of saying, here are the constraints, here are the economic constraints. And then it was really amongst us as the three production company partners to figure out how we would, it was always clear that I was brought in to be the editorial lead, but in terms of managing the production, dealing with cast and crew and things like that, that was something that we had to negotiate and find our way through, which we did. I think by the end of the third or fourth episode, it was very clear how it was going to work, and I think that worked pretty well. With a show like Leonardo or Medici with Lux Vitae, it's a very different situation because we're shooting in Italy exclusively. They own their own sound stages in Italy. They have relationships with the broadcaster, with all the local governments that are going to be where we're going to be shooting. They shoot there all the time. So they are very clearly in the production lead. And we are working with their crews and their department heads, the people they work with, basically on a continuous basis because they have so many shows. So we're coming in, and it's really an Italian show. It just so happens it's being written in English, and we're sort of the guest editorial lead, but it's deeply collaborative with them. And there was a wonderful head of drama who sadly has passed away at Lux Vitae called Sarah Melodia, who was very, very challenging in the best possible way. It was a great sort of editorial tennis match with her, trying to develop all these shows, and we had wonderful sort of sparring going on about the editorial line, but in a way that really fueled the strength of the show. So I've done other shows, though, like I did a show called Indian Detective. I was talking with somebody which was a German-Canadian co-production that shot in South Africa. And that was for Netflix and for CTV in Canada. And so just every time you do a co-production, the constellation of voices and the division of responsibilities is going to be unique. And no two are the same. You have to figure out every time you do it. And there's not very many ways to succeed. There's very, very many ways to fail. And so you're always trying to figure out where are the leaks in this boat and how am I going to plug them up. So it's, like I say, it's not for the faint of heart.
What was the casting process like with so many different needs of broadcasters?
That's such a good question. The casting process for Ransom, so it was an English language show, but it was a French-Canadian co-production. So it made it very difficult to cast French actors, which they clearly wanted. And there was a photo I showed of the cast, and one of those actresses was French, but she was a recurring role. She wasn't one of the series regulars. It was very hard to find a French actor in that age range whose English was so fluent that we felt it would be a distraction. And TF1 accepted that there would be the French actress, but that she would only be recurring, that she wasn't a series regular. And then the rest of the cast were Canadian, except for the lead, who was British. But we were open to Canadian or British. We couldn't cast American because it's a French-Canadian co-production. Right? There's a point system about these co-productions and having an American. And honestly, believe it or not, I am Italian as well as American. Thanks to my wife, I hold an Italian passport as well as an American passport. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to do Ransom as an American. The Canadians understandably need to protect their market from people like me. So anyway, it just so happened we felt the best actor for the lead was a British actor, and the rest were Canadian. But that was a political process as well. And I think that the hard thing about doing these co-productions is making them feel organic and not like committee decisions. There was a show that I came on board the second season and tried but failed to rescue called Crossing Lines. I don't know if anybody saw that. And that was a show where I felt like just the design of the show felt like a calculation, because it was one French, one German, one, and I think that's a really hard formula to make work, because in a way it kind of belongs to everybody and belongs to nobody. When you see a show like that, it feels like, well, yeah, it's so international, but actually it's not really any country's point of view. So I've learned over time to look for things that are organic to one place but feel international. Like I think Leonardo, he's Italian, but he kind of feels like he belongs to everybody. Or the Medici family is Italian, but it feels like the history of civilization, like of modern capitalism and modern culture. So editorially, I look for things like that are centered on one place or one character rather than collecting people from different cultures, which I think is trickier. Having said that, I'm now developing a series about Nuremberg, which just contradicts everything I just said, because it's...
You mentioned success and you mentioned failure. After all these years, are you still afraid of the possibility of failure?
Constantly. I think, and I often talk about this in a writing context because I teach. I've been teaching for 10 years in Berlin at this program called Serialize. Storytelling is so complex. It has so many variables that even the greatest storytellers, I don't care, Steven Spielberg, Aaron Sorkin, whoever your heroes are, can still fall on their face, because it isn't one size fits all. Every time you design a story, you're having to distill your understanding of human experience and the way people behave in a new way that's never been done before. If you're doing it right, it's utterly unique every time, which means you may fail. And that's a scary thing, but it's not a bad thing. It's why this is actually a worthwhile career. It's why it will always be interesting. You will never get bored. You will never rest on your laurels, not if you're doing it right. You've got to stay awake and open and listen. And the other thing I should just mention about co-productions that I have learned, especially coming from an American TV culture, which is it was a monoculture, especially when I left America in 2010, right? Before Netflix, before Squid Game, before Lupin, right? We didn't watch anybody else's TV in America. We sold our TV all over the world, but we didn't watch anybody else's. That has now thankfully changed. But nonetheless, I think there is still an attitude from Americans like, well, we know better. Look how successful our TV is. But as an American coming to work in Europe and meeting first British producers and then French and German and Italian and then Canadian, you start to realize that there are other ways of telling stories and there are other cultural sensibilities and sensitivities. And you need to listen and you need to have a humility, and they're telling you things that actually you don't understand about what a French audience will accept. I told that story that, it's a funny story about having to shoot in the south of France and pretend, I was in Washington, D.C., but they may have been right about that. they may have been right that a French audience wouldn't accept that narrative taking place on French soil. And your job when you're collaborating with people from different cultures is to listen to their points of view. It doesn't mean they're automatically right. They can be wrong. But you need to be humble enough to listen. And they're probably telling you something that is, at a very minimum, you'd be wise to listen to and consider in your decision making. And so I think I've learned a lot by working with different cultures about my own point of view and about other people's points of view, and it's enriched me as a storyteller. Right on time. Thank you.